Skills Kitchen. Now remember, right here in these videos, we're going to talk about some of the most important skills that you need as a student of a history classroom. Now, as I've said before, these skills are often transferable across multiple disciplines, but as always, make sure you check with your teacher. At the end of the day, they're the ones that are going to be marking you. They may have different opinions or preferences. So, today, we are going to be looking at command terms, what are sometimes called cognitive verbs. Now that probably means a little bit of gobbledygook to you, but what they are is effectively what the question is actually asking, and it's usually the first word or first couple of words of a question, whether it's a short answer, extended response, or essay. And because here at History Skills Kitchen we like to do things a little bit different, a little bit far away from the boring stuff, we're going to do things using food. And today, it's biscuits that we are going to use to talk about the differences between the command terms and how they can help you decide what is actually necessary to include in each question you're given. Okay, so let's make a start with the most simple questions. These are your short answer questions that are probably in an exam only worth 1 mark. They may even be multiple choice questions. We're going to use that using the butternut snap. Humble biscuit, not really a lot to it. Not to say that it's not good, but it is simple. This reminds me of questions that start with the command term identify. Now, if something says identify, all it asks you to do is to literally identify, name something. So if the question is something on the lines of identify 2 long-term causes of the First World War, you don't even have to put it into a sentence. You can just answer with militarism and imperialism. That's it. If it's worth 2 marks, you'll get those 2 marks. 1 point for each thing. You can also have the humble butternut snap for a define question, asking for a simple definition of something. So if the question is asking you to define the term militarism in regards to the First World War, you have to say something along the lines that militarism is the ideology that promotes the importance and necessity of war that impacts all aspects of that nation's life. All right, again, should only be worth 1 or 2 marks, simple yet effective. And it's important to not waste time on these questions. Get in and get out nice and quick. Butternut snap. The next type of command term we have are the 2 pointers, right? And that we have our choc chip cookie. Now, typical sort of cookie, but there's a little bit of extra something in there. And these are often worth 2, sometimes more marks depending on what they ask for. So these are your identify and explain. So if we go back to that original question of identify 2 long-term causes of the First World War, if we add to that identify and explain 2 long-term causes of the First World War, not only would you have to say militarism and imperialism, you would have to explain briefly, and I mean in a sentence, how those 2 contributed to the cause of the First World War. Again, you don't need to go over the top with this. This should be short and sharp. There should be the identification and a 1 or 2 sentence explanation for whatever it is. Make sure you read those questions carefully. Sometimes they'll ask for 1, 2, or however many, and that is where a lot of marks may be lost. You can also use this for describe. Describe the conditions of the trenches during the First World War. Describe the conditions on the Eastern Front during the Second World War. Now, again, you should have a look at how many lines are going to be dictated to this or how many marks these particular questions are worth. But generally speaking, describe questions don't require a lot of information. Generally speaking, they don't require sources, although some may. Make sure you read the question to find out. And they also don't want you to give a full story about it. They just want you, again, to be nice and concise, get in and get out. So your chopped chip cookie, excellent, needs a little bit more information, but still good. Now, we're starting to get into a little bit more complex sort of questions. So next we have the humble Kingston. Now, we're starting to get to more extended response styles of questions. You see this one here has a little bit of a filling into it. Again, the biscuit itself, not too complex, but we do have the delicious chocolate cream filling. Now, this is going to be for things kind of a little bit more that ask for example, evidence. Now, you have to be careful. Sometimes you'll get a short answer question that requires evidence. That is often towards the end of the question, and it is so easily missed. And oftentimes, this is the point where a lot of students are going to miss out on marks because they've skimmed past that particular section. So they've given the biscuit, but they haven't given the delicious filling. So please make sure that you read your questions very, very carefully. In fact, I recommend that with all questions, you go through with a pen or a highlighter and you actually annotate your either exam papers or your task sheets so you know exactly what it is that's there. So looking at the command term, but also things like include evidence or including how many of something you need, right? Whether it's 2 examples, whether it's a source, etc. Okay, so that is your humble Kingston. Now we're starting to get a little bit more complicated, definitely towards our extended response. So we now have our wonderful shortbread creams. This is asking you to justify. If you have a question that asks you to justify something, that means you have to stack the evidence to one side or another. And the reason why I chose a shortbread cream is, I don't know about you, but this is how I eat my shortbread creams. I often break it apart, and almost always, most of the cream will be on one side more than the other. You'll notice that there's a little bit of cream on this side, and that's because you do need to acknowledge, or you should always acknowledge, the other perspective, but you also must talk about why it's wrong. So you should have a clear argument or view in mind that's outlined right from the very beginning. All right, that's shortbread cream. We now come to the humble compare and contrast, which I'm using the Scotch finger to talk about. Why? Because there really is technically 2 parts to this particular question. We have a compare, looking at the similarities between 2 concepts, and our contrast, the differences between the 2 concepts. Now, Scotch finger is one single biscuit, and that means that when you're actually doing a compare and contrast question, you need to be doing both simultaneously. Ideally, you don't want to have a whole paragraph about similarities and a whole paragraph about differences. So for example, if your question is compare and contrast the social structure of medieval Japan and medieval England, then what you want to be doing is looking at 3 themes, 3 concepts that you could discuss, and they will be your body paragraphs. And then in each of those, you will be both comparing and contrasting, look at both similarities and differences, using the word however, my favorite word when it comes to responses. So that's your Scotch finger, the compare and contrast. Now we're getting to some of my favorites. Essays. We need a little bit more than just biscuit. Then we have slice. One of my favorite biscuits, although not as versatile as some. This is your evaluate. When you're asked to evaluate a question, you are asked to weigh up a particular question. So if your question is somewhere along the lines of evaluate the reasons why the Allies won during the Second World War, that means you need to be able to talk about 3 key reasons, but also talk about other things that are involved in that. There's more in this. You have to back this up with sources. There is no other way around that. Even if the question doesn't ask you to, you have to use sources, you have to use evidence to support your answer. That is absolutely essential. And generally an evaluate question, and this also applies to an analyze question, or even if you have to, an argue question, you have to have that delicious mint filling. Otherwise, it's just a basic chocolate biscuit. And finally, the favorite of everybody. The Tim Tam stands for the granddaddy of questions, and that is to what extent. Now, the reason why this is the granddaddy, I think, and my personal favorite of responses or command terms is because if you have a question to what extent, you are being asked to give a spectrum answer. So if your question is to what extent was, just trying to think off the top of my head, to what extent was German failure during the First World War inevitable? Okay? Your answer to that question, your hypothesis, should not be either fully yes or fully no. What you need to be doing is saying mostly yes or mostly no, and you have to have a however. It has to be a multi-layered response, and it has to be backed up with evidence. It should be backed up with both primary and secondary sources and very clear, concise examples. This should be very clearly communicated from the very beginning to the very end, which is why it's multi-purpose Australian classic is to what extent. So I hope this video has helped you out in figuring out what it is, what's meant by command terms, and how understanding these command terms will help you respond correctly and appropriately in your next exam or assessment. Thank you for watching History Skills Kitchen, and I'll see you next time.